Good morning to all. Myself, Dr. B. V. Ramana. In this video, we will discuss strong entity and weak entity. In the previous video, we discussed the various symbols used in ER diagram. The symbol used for strong entity is rectangle, whereas the symbol used for representing weak entity is double rectangle. The name itself indicates that strong entity, it doesn't depend on other entities, whereas weak entity depends on other entity. Strong entity does not depend on any other entity, whereas regarding weak entity, it depends on other entities. And coming to strong entity, it has a primary key. Weak entity, it doesn't have primary key, but it has partial key. The relationship between two strong entities are represented with the symbol diamond. That is nothing but strong relationship or relationship. Whereas the relationship between strong entity and weak entity is represented with identifying relationship. The symbol used for identifying relationship is double diamond. Here we can observe employee is a strong entity, whereas dependent is a weak entity. That's why employee is represented with a rectangle, whereas dependent is represented with a double rectangle. Let us consider one example to understand strong entity and weak entity clearly. You can take some employees here. The employees working in an organization, that you can call it as the employee entity. Each employee may have the dependents. For example, you can take some dependents here. In this diagram, you can observe that there are three employees. Let us denote employee 1, employee 2, employee 3, and they have dependents. Suppose employee 1 has one children and wife. Let us consider employee 1 is an officer in that organization, whereas employee 2 may be a driver for him. The dependent name of employee 1 also B Lakshmi, and of employee 2 also B Lakshmi. Then here the dependent with a name not at all possible to recognize who is she. Then how the B Lakshmi is recognized, the dependent is recognized with, if you add the employee, that means wife of employee 1, then the dependent is recognized. That means here whatever the entities exist in the dependent table are not uniquely identified on its own. Add the employee details, then only they can be identified. I think this example will allow you to understand. Whereas if you consider the employee, they have employee IDs, definitely they can easily recognized. And if you consider in this example, employee 3, he is not married, for example, he just joined in that organization. No doubt he is an employee, but he doesn't have any dependents. We will see these things, we can understand in detail with sample ER diagram. See, here employee ID is underlined, that means it's a key attribute or primary key attribute or prime attribute. So employees are uniquely identified with their employee IDs. There is no problem. Each and every employee is recognized uniquely with the employee ID. So that's a strong entity. Whereas coming to dependent has two attributes. Dependent name, age, there may be some other attributes, maybe relationship, maybe address or whatever it may be. Let us consider only two attributes for our convenience. For example, a dependent name is a partial key. See here, dotted one. That means here there is no primary key here. Then it's very difficult to identify the dependents uniquely. But each entity must be identified uniquely. In this dependent also must be identified uniquely. Here in this dependent table, you have a partial key, that is B Lakshmi. Both the driver and officer wife's names are same. In that case, dependents are not uniquely recognized or identified. This is weak entity. We need to identify the dependents uniquely. How means we will see. And before going to that, whatever the relationship between this weak entity and the strong entity, that relationship is nothing but identifying relationship. Our aim is we need to convert this partial key into primary key. That means we need to identify the dependents uniquely. How to convert means, here you can observe that This weak entity has a connection with some strong entity via identifying relationship. From this strong entity, you have to take the employee ID and add to this particular dependent table. So that what happens here, employee ID you have to add to the dependent name, so that by combining these two attributes, employee ID and dependent name, we can generate a primary key so that we can identify the tuples or dependents uniquely. That means who is B Lakshmi means here we'll see the particular example how to identify the dependents uniquely. See, just now we observed that dependent is uniquely identified by adding the employee ID, that is a primary key in the employee table, okay, or employee entity. That means just like if you add dependent name and employee ID, these two combinedly as a primary key for the dependent table. For example, you can consider B Lakshmi, wife of E1. Then you can easily recognize B Lakshmi after adding her husband details. In another way, for example, second one, B Lakshmi, wife of E2. Then also you can easily recognize who is this dependent. This is the way you are going to identify the dependent by adding the primary key of the strong entity to the partial key of the weak entity, so that you can generate a primary key for the weak entity, so that you can identify the dependents individually. Okay, I think you understood these concepts. Okay, then here in this diagram we'll concentrate on another part, that is the participation constraint. In this CR diagram, employee has dependents. The connection between employee and relationship, identifying relationship, is single line, represented with single line. This is called as partial participation. Whereas the connection between identifying relationship and the weak entity is represented with a double line. This is nothing but total participation. Total participation means all the dependents have connection with some employee. That means all the entities belongs to dependent have a connection with some employee. Whereas regarding partial participation, some of the employees doesn't have any connection with the dependent. Again, we'll understand this partial participation, total participation in the previous example. Let us consider this example. Here there are some dependents. Whenever there are some dependents in an organization, definitely they have some relation with some employees. Then only they will be existed. Otherwise there is no existence of, without there is no employee means there is no dependent. So dependents are means definitely there is a employee. Whenever there are employees, some employees, that doesn't mean that they must have dependent. They may have dependent or may not have dependents. So in this example, from dependent side you can see they have connection to employees. From employee side, there are three employees, employee 1, employee 2, employee 3, but employee 3 doesn't have any dependents. So from employee side there is a partial participation, whereas from dependent side there is a full participation. Now we will summarize all the points related to strong entity or entity set, weak entity. This strong entity is represented with a rectangle, whereas weak entity with a double rectangle. It has a primary key, whereas weak entity doesn't have a primary key and it has a partial key. That partial key we need to convert into the primary key. We saw the example how to convert. It doesn't depend on any entity because it's a strong entity, whereas weak entity, it must depend on one strong entity. Because of the primary key, strong entity, the records are identified uniquely, whereas here records are not identified uniquely, so that we need to generate a primary key for the weak entity. The relationship between two strong entity sets are represented with a diamond, whereas the relationship between one strong and one weak entity is represented with double diamond. And here you have a partial participation in the strong entity, that's why it is represented with a single line, whereas in weak entity always it has total participation, that's why it is represented with a double line. Thank you one and all.